You never expect the person teaching you how to drive to quietly change the direction of your entire life. Ethan Brooks had always imagined his first driving lesson would be awkward, stressful, and filled with nervous mistakes, but he never imagined it would begin a chapter that would slowly redefine everything he believed about trust, kindness, and the unexpected ways people enter each other's lives. At 24, Ethan had postponed getting his driver's license for years because living in the city made public transportation easier than owning a car. His best friend Ryan had teased him about it countless times until one Saturday morning, he finally announced that the problem had been solved. Ryan's father had once worked as a part-time driving instructor, and after hearing Ethan complain about scheduling expensive lessons, he had casually offered to help. Ethan accepted without giving it much thought. To him, Daniel Walker was simply Ryan's father, someone he had seen during birthday parties, backyard barbecues, and holiday dinners over the years. Daniel had always greeted him with an easy smile, asked polite questions about work, and quietly disappeared whenever the younger crowd gathered together. Ethan never really considered him beyond that familiar role. The following weekend, Ethan arrived at the Walker family driveway, just after 9 o'clock on a clear autumn morning. A silver sedan waited neatly in front of the house while crisp leaves drifted across the quiet suburban street. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Ethan before offering a warm smile that immediately eased the nervous tension written across Ethan's face. Instead of beginning with rules or instructions, Daniel asked how work had been going, whether Ethan still enjoyed graphic design, and what had finally convinced him to learn to drive. The conversation felt surprisingly relaxed, almost as though they had known each other far better than they actually had. Once they settled inside the car, Daniel calmly adjusted the mirrors and patiently explained each control without rushing a single sentence. When Ethan accidentally pressed the brake too firmly during the first few minutes, he immediately apologized, embarrassed by the sudden stop. Daniel simply laughed softly and reminded him that everyone started exactly the same way. There was no criticism, no frustration, and no pressure to be perfect. As they slowly drove through quiet residential streets lined with maple trees glowing beneath the morning sunlight, Ethan noticed something unexpected. Daniel possessed an unusual ability to make even mistakes feel like part of the learning process instead of personal failures. Every correction sounded encouraging rather than judgmental. Every instruction carried the quiet confidence of someone who genuinely wanted another person to succeed. During a short break at a neighborhood park, they stood beside the car drinking the last of their coffee while watching families enjoy the cool weekend weather. Daniel spoke about responsibility behind the wheel, but somehow the conversation expanded into responsibility in everyday life, explaining that confidence rarely appeared all at once. Instead, it grew one careful decision at a time. Ethan listened more closely than he realized, not because the advice sounded extraordinary, but because it felt honest. By the end of the lesson, he had managed smooth turns, confident lane changes, and even a successful parallel parking attempt that left both of them smiling. As Ethan thanked Daniel before heading home, he found himself looking forward to the next lesson for reasons that had surprisingly little to do with driving. For the first time in years, he felt that someone had quietly reminded him learning something new did not require becoming someone different. Sometimes it simply required meeting the right teacher at exactly the right moment. The second driving lesson arrived the following Saturday beneath a sky so clear that the morning sunlight seemed to stretch endlessly across the quiet suburban streets. Ethan found himself leaving his apartment almost 30 minutes earlier than necessary, something he usually never did on weekends. At first, he blamed it on nervousness about driving through busier roads, but deep down he suspected there was another reason he could not quite explain. When he pulled into the Walker family driveway, Daniel was already standing beside the familiar silver sedan, checking the tire pressure before noticing Ethan's arrival. He greeted him with the same relaxed smile as the week before and handed him another cup of coffee without asking what he preferred. Somehow Daniel had already remembered exactly how Ethan liked it. The small gesture should not have meant much, yet Ethan appreciated it more than he expected. Once they settled inside the car, Daniel suggested they leave the neighborhood and practice on wider roads with slightly heavier traffic. Ethan felt his hands tighten around the steering wheel, but Daniel calmly reminded him to breathe naturally and trust what he had already learned. Every instruction arrived with quiet patience instead of urgency. They drove through peaceful residential streets before entering a busy commercial district where traffic lights, pedestrians, delivery trucks, and weekend shoppers created a more realistic driving environment. Ethan made several small mistakes while changing lanes, immediately apologizing each time, but Daniel simply smiled and explained that confidence was built one careful decision after another rather than through perfection. As the lesson continued, the conversations gradually became less about driving. Daniel asked Ethan what had first inspired him to become a graphic designer. Ethan admitted that he had always enjoyed creating something that could quietly improve another person's day without demanding attention. Daniel nodded thoughtfully before explaining that he had chosen engineering for a similar reason, because well-designed bridges and buildings often became invisible parts of everyday life, while making thousands of lives easier. Ethan had never expected to discover so many similarities between them. During a short break, they stopped at a small bakery overlooking a peaceful park where families enjoyed the cool autumn weather. Sitting outside with fresh pastries and coffee, they talked about favorite books, old movies, road trips, and places they still hoped to visit someday. Ethan noticed that Daniel listened with complete attention, never interrupting and never trying to impress anyone with his own experiences. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions that made every conversation feel meaningful. When they returned to the car, Ethan realized nearly an hour had passed without either of them noticing. The drive home felt smoother than before. Ethan successfully navigated several complicated intersections, merged confidently onto a larger highway, and even laughed when he accidentally activated the windshield wipers instead of the turn signal. Daniel laughed with him rather than at him, transforming every mistake into another shared memory instead of an embarrassment. As they parked back in the driveway, Daniel complimented Ethan's steady improvement and suggested practicing again the following weekend if his schedule allowed. Ethan answered yes almost immediately. Driving back to his apartment later that afternoon, Ethan realized something quietly unexpected had happened. The driving lessons had become only one part of the experience. What he anticipated most each week was the conversation, the calm encouragement, and the unusual feeling of being completely understood by someone who never expected him to become anyone other than himself. And although he still believed he was simply grateful for a remarkable teacher, a small part of his heart had already begun looking forward to those Saturday mornings far more than it probably should have. By the third weekend, Ethan no longer counted the driving lessons by how many miles he completed or how many parking exercises he mastered. Instead, he measured them by conversations that somehow lingered in his mind long after he returned home. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds, and the cool autumn air hinted that rain was not far away. Daniel suggested they practice on a scenic highway just outside the city where the traffic moved steadily without becoming overwhelming. Ethan settled behind the steering wheel with noticeably greater confidence than before, adjusting the mirrors almost automatically before starting the engine. Daniel noticed the improvement immediately, but simply offered an encouraging smile instead of making a grand compliment. That quiet confidence had become one of the things Ethan admired most. They spent nearly an hour driving through rolling hills lined with brilliant shades of orange, crimson, and gold. Daniel introduced more advanced driving situations, calmly explaining how to anticipate the decisions of other drivers rather than simply reacting to them. Ethan listened carefully, realizing that nearly every lesson about driving seemed to carry another lesson about life. Daniel often spoke about patience, responsibility, and learning to stay calm when unexpected situations appeared. The advice never sounded rehearsed. It came naturally from someone who had lived long enough to understand that rushing rarely solved anything worthwhile. As they continued along the winding highway, the first drops of rain began tapping softly against the windshield. Within minutes, the steady drizzle became a heavy autumn shower that reduced visibility and encouraged drivers to slow down. Daniel instructed Ethan to leave the highway and follow a quiet country road until they reached a small family-owned cafe overlooking a peaceful lake. They hurried inside, carrying the scent of fresh rain on their jackets before finding a table beside a large window. Outside, gentle ripples spread across the water while colorful leaves floated near the shoreline. The warm smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie filled the cozy room, creating a welcome contrast to the chilly afternoon beyond the glass. What began as a short weather break quietly turned into the longest conversation they had shared so far. Ethan admitted that he sometimes worried he had started his career too quickly without truly discovering what kind of life he wanted beyond work. Daniel nodded with understanding before sharing that he had once believed success was measured only through promotions and larger projects until he gradually realized that meaningful relationships gave every achievement its real value. Ethan found himself asking questions he had never planned to ask. He learned about Daniel's passion for restoring old furniture, his habit of reading historical biographies on quiet evenings, and the road trips he had taken with Ryan when he was young. Daniel asked equally thoughtful questions about Ethan's childhood, his parents, and the creative projects he still hoped to pursue someday. Hours seemed to disappear unnoticed until the rain finally softened into a gentle mist. When they returned to the car, neither of them immediately reached for the door handles. They simply stood beside the lake for a quiet moment, appreciating the peaceful silence surrounding them. The drive back felt unusually comfortable, as though an invisible distance had quietly disappeared somewhere between the rainstorm and the cafe conversation. Later that evening, Ethan caught himself smiling while remembering small details of the afternoon instead of the driving lesson itself. For the first time, he wondered whether the growing warmth he felt whenever Daniel smiled had become something far more personal than simple admiration. And that realization remained with him long after the autumn rain had completely disappeared. The following weekend arrived with bright sunshine and crisp autumn air, making the Walker family backyard the perfect place for Ryan's annual neighborhood cookout. Ethan had attended the gathering for years, always blending comfortably into the familiar circle of friends and relatives. This time, however, everything felt slightly different, although he could not explain why. Perhaps it was because the driving lessons had quietly transformed Daniel from someone he simply knew into someone whose opinions, laughter, and quiet presence now occupied far more space in his thoughts than he wanted to admit. Ethan greeted Ryan with their usual friendly jokes before helping arrange tables and carry coolers across the yard. Children played nearby while neighbors gathered beneath colorful trees, and the comforting smell of grilled food drifted through the afternoon air. Daniel moved naturally among the guests, welcoming everyone with the same calm kindness Ethan had come to admire during their weekly lessons. Several times throughout the afternoon, their eyes met across the yard. Each exchange lasted only a second before both looked away with polite smiles. Yet Ethan noticed those brief moments more than every conversation happening around him. Later, everyone gathered around the long outdoor table as stories, laughter, and friendly teasing filled the backyard. Ryan casually mentioned that Ethan had become a surprisingly confident driver after only a few lessons. Another friend laughed and joked that Daniel had clearly discovered his favorite student. Before Ethan could respond, Ryan grinned and added, "Honestly, you two probably spend more time talking than Dad and I do. Sometimes you seem more like friends than instructor and student." The table erupted with harmless laughter, but Ethan suddenly felt the warmth rise to his face. He glanced toward Daniel, expecting him to laugh along with everyone else. Instead, Daniel smiled politely before lowering his eyes toward his coffee cup for a quiet moment. The conversation quickly shifted to football, upcoming vacations, and neighborhood events, yet Ryan's innocent observation continued echoing inside Ethan's thoughts. It had been spoken as nothing more than a joke, but it quietly forced Ethan to acknowledge something he had carefully avoided. Their conversations no longer felt ordinary. He looked forward to them throughout the entire week. After lunch, Ethan volunteered to help Daniel carry empty trays into the kitchen. The short walk inside the house felt unexpectedly quiet after the lively backyard gathering. As they placed the dishes on the counter, Daniel smiled with gentle amusement. Ryan has never been very good at realizing when he embarrasses people. Ethan laughed softly. He has been doing that since college. Their shared laughter dissolved the awkwardness almost immediately. Before returning outside, Daniel paused beside the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. "I hope his joke did not make you uncomfortable." Ethan considered the question carefully before answering honestly. "No, it only made me realize how much I enjoy these weekends." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful but warm. "I do too." Neither of them added anything else. There was no need. As Ethan drove home that evening beneath glowing orange skies, he replayed that brief conversation over and over again. Nothing inappropriate had been said. Nothing dramatic had happened. Yet for reasons he could no longer ignore, Ryan's casual remark had quietly shifted something inside him. For the first time, Ethan stopped wondering why he looked forward to every driving lesson and began wondering what those feelings might truly mean if he ever found the courage to face them. The next driving lesson began beneath a pale autumn sky that promised another cool, peaceful morning. Ethan noticed that Daniel seemed quieter than usual as they followed a familiar route toward the outskirts of the city. Nothing appeared wrong, yet there was a thoughtful calm in Daniel's expression that had not been there before. Ethan assumed it was simply another ordinary day until they stopped at a scenic overlook beside a wide lake where they often took short breaks during practice sessions. The water reflected rows of colorful trees while a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the empty parking area. Daniel handed Ethan a cup of coffee before leaning comfortably against the side of the silver sedan. After several quiet moments, he spoke with an unusually reflective smile. "I received an interesting phone call this week." Ethan looked at him with quiet curiosity. Daniel explained that a large engineering company had offered him the opportunity to oversee a long-term construction project in Colorado. It would be a significant promotion, one that many professionals would immediately accept without hesitation. The position promised new challenges, greater responsibility, and the chance to lead a remarkable team for several years. Ethan congratulated him almost automatically because he genuinely admired everything Daniel had accomplished throughout his career. Daniel thanked him warmly, yet his smile never fully reached his eyes. As they resumed driving, Ethan found it surprisingly difficult to focus on the road. Every turn, every traffic light, and every mile suddenly carried a quiet awareness that these weekends might not continue forever. He had always assumed there would be another lesson, another conversation, another peaceful Saturday morning waiting just ahead. For the first time, he realized that ordinary moments only feel endless until someone reminds you they may eventually come to an end. Daniel continued offering calm guidance exactly as he always had, patiently correcting small mistakes and encouraging Ethan whenever he handled more challenging situations successfully. Nothing about his teaching changed, but everything felt different. During another short stop beside the lake, Ethan found himself asking when the company expected an answer. Daniel admitted they wanted his decision within a few weeks. "It is a wonderful opportunity," he said softly. "But some decisions are more complicated than they first appear." Ethan nodded, even though he understood the sentence meant far more than a career discussion. On the drive back toward town, they spoke about simple things such as favorite restaurants, holiday traditions, and books they still hoped to read before the end of the year. Yet beneath every ordinary conversation lingered the quiet possibility that their weekends together were becoming limited. Later that evening, Ethan returned home and placed his practice notebook on the kitchen table without opening it. Instead of reviewing driving techniques, he found himself remembering Daniel's thoughtful expression while talking about Colorado. He walked to the apartment window and watched the city lights appear one by one as dusk settled across the skyline. Only then did he finally admit the truth he had spent weeks quietly avoiding. The possibility of Daniel moving across the country did not simply make him sad because he would lose an excellent driving instructor. It frightened him because somewhere between coffee breaks, winding roads, patient conversations, and ordinary Saturday mornings, Daniel had become the person Ethan most looked forward to seeing each week. Realizing that truth did not bring clarity, it only made the approaching decision feel infinitely more important than either of them had yet spoken aloud. The following Saturday arrived with a quiet stillness that neither Ethan nor Daniel tried to explain. The morning sky was bright, the air carried the cool freshness of late autumn, and the familiar silver sedan waited in the driveway exactly as it had every weekend before. Yet both of them sensed that this lesson felt different. Ethan settled behind the steering wheel with calm confidence, completing each adjustment before Daniel even needed to mention it. Daniel noticed the smooth routine and smiled with genuine pride. "You are driving on instinct now," he said warmly. Ethan smiled back. "I guess I finally stopped thinking about every little movement." Daniel nodded. "That is usually when real confidence begins." Instead of following their usual route, Daniel suggested taking a scenic drive toward the quiet lakeside highway, where traffic remained light and the landscape opened into rolling hills covered with brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Ethan guided the car confidently through gentle curves, maintaining a steady speed while soft morning sunlight reflected across the calm water beside the road. For several miles, neither of them spoke very much. The silence felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable, as though both were quietly gathering the courage to say something important. Eventually, Daniel suggested they stop at their favorite overlook beside the lake. They carried coffee from a nearby cafe and stood watching small ripples move across the water while a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the empty parking area. Ethan looked toward the peaceful shoreline before speaking with unusual honesty. "Can I tell you something without making things awkward?" Daniel turned toward him with the same patient expression that had reassured Ethan since their very first lesson. "You can tell me anything." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly continuing. "When these lessons started, I thought I was only learning how to drive. Somewhere along the way, they became the part of every week I looked forward to most." Daniel remained silent, allowing Ethan to continue at his own pace. "I realized something after you mentioned Colorado. The idea of finishing these lessons does not bother me nearly as much as the thought that I might not have a reason to see you anymore." Ethan paused, searching carefully for words that remained respectful and honest. "I know our friendship exists because you are Ryan's father. I know life is complicated. I am not asking you for anything. I just did not want to pretend those feelings did not exist anymore." The breeze gently stirred the surface of the lake as Daniel looked across the quiet water before answering. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable emotion behind every word. "For several weeks I have been asking myself why I kept looking forward to Saturday mornings as much as you did." He smiled gently before continuing. "At first I told myself I simply enjoyed helping you succeed. Then I realized our conversations had become just as important to me as the driving lessons themselves." Ethan listened without interrupting. Daniel took a slow breath. "That realization frightened me because I wanted to make certain that whatever I felt came from honesty, maturity, and genuine respect for everyone involved, especially Ryan." Ethan nodded in complete understanding. Neither of them moved any closer. Neither of them rushed the conversation. They simply stood beside one another watching the quiet lake while the truth settled naturally between them. On the drive home, Ethan completed every turn, every lane change, and every stop with calm confidence. But he hardly noticed the road itself. What remained in his thoughts was not uncertainty anymore. It was the quiet realization that two people could arrive at the same truth independently, and sometimes the greatest courage was not speaking quickly, but waiting until the moment when honesty could finally be shared with complete respect. Several days passed after the conversation by the lake, giving both Ethan and Daniel the time they had promised each other. Neither of them rushed toward dramatic decisions, and neither pretended the conversation had never happened. Instead, they allowed honesty to settle naturally into their lives. Ethan returned to work with surprising clarity. Designing layouts for clients usually occupied every corner of his attention, yet now he found himself smiling whenever he remembered Daniel's quiet promise that truth deserved patience. Daniel also continued his routine, balancing engineering meetings and family responsibilities while carefully considering every consequence that could follow the feelings they had finally acknowledged. One Thursday evening, Daniel called Ethan and asked whether he would like to meet for coffee after work instead of another driving lesson. Ethan agreed immediately. They chose the same quiet cafe overlooking the river where they had often stopped during practice drives. The familiar tables, warm lights, and peaceful atmosphere somehow made the conversation feel easier. After they ordered coffee, Daniel looked at Ethan with calm sincerity. "I have spent many nights thinking about what we talked about." Ethan listened without interrupting. Daniel continued, "I realized that my greatest concern has never been the difference in our ages. It has always been making certain that every decision reflects respect, honesty, and responsibility." Ethan nodded. "I feel exactly the same way." Daniel smiled gently before speaking again. "Ryan deserves complete honesty. I never want him to believe that anything happened behind his back or that our friendship with him was ever taken for granted." Ethan appreciated those words more than he could explain. They reflected everything he had admired about Daniel from the beginning. "I would never want that either," Ethan answered quietly. "Ryan has been my best friend for years. Whatever happens next should never come at the expense of that friendship." Daniel leaned back comfortably, his expression noticeably more peaceful. "Then perhaps we already know what the right path looks like." Ethan looked at him with quiet curiosity. Daniel explained that before making any decisions about Colorado or about their future, he wanted to have an honest conversation with Ryan. There would be no secrets, no rushed choices, and no assumptions. Ethan agreed immediately. The plan did not erase every uncertainty, but it replaced fear with integrity. They spent the rest of the evening talking about ordinary things again. They discussed upcoming holidays, favorite road trips, and books they wanted to read during the winter. The conversation flowed as naturally as it always had, except now every smile carried the comfort of knowing that neither of them needed to hide behind silence anymore. When they stepped outside, cool evening air drifted across the river while city lights shimmered against the calm water. They walked slowly toward the parking lot without feeling the need to rush the moment. Before getting into their cars, Daniel paused and looked at Ethan with quiet warmth. No matter what happens after I speak with Ryan, I do not regret telling the truth. Ethan smiled with complete honesty. Neither do I. They exchanged one final reassuring smile before driving home separately through the peaceful autumn evening. For the first time since the driving lessons had begun, Ethan realized that the road ahead no longer felt frightening. It remained uncertain, but uncertainty no longer meant loneliness. Whatever the future held, it would begin with openness, respect, and the courage to let the people who mattered most hear the truth before anyone else. 3 quiet days passed before Daniel finally invited Ryan to dinner at the small neighborhood restaurant their family had visited for years. Ethan knew the conversation was happening that evening, yet he deliberately stayed away because Daniel believed the discussion should begin between father and son. Ethan spent the night walking through city streets beneath glowing storefront lights, checking his phone far more often than he cared to admit, but no messages arrived. He reminded himself that trust also meant allowing difficult conversations to happen without trying to control the outcome. Late that evening, his phone finally rang. Daniel's calm voice immediately eased the anxiety that had quietly followed Ethan throughout the day. Daniel asked if they could meet the following afternoon at the same lakeside overlook where they had shared so many important conversations. Ethan agreed without hesitation. The next afternoon, autumn sunlight shimmered gently across the water while cool air carried the scent of fallen leaves through the nearly empty park. Daniel was already waiting beside the familiar silver sedan, holding 2 cups of coffee, just as he had on the morning of their very first driving lesson. Ethan noticed something different before a single word was spoken. Daniel looked peaceful. They walked slowly toward the wooden railing overlooking the lake before Daniel finally broke the comfortable silence. He explained that he had spoken honestly with Ryan about everything. There had been surprise, many thoughtful questions, and several long moments of quiet reflection. Ryan admitted he had never imagined such a conversation would happen, but he also recognized that nothing inappropriate had ever taken place. Daniel had waited until both of them fully understood their own feelings before speaking openly, and Ethan had never hidden or manipulated the friendship they shared. Daniel smiled gently before repeating the words Ryan had said just before leaving the restaurant. If both of you have always treated each other with honesty and respect, then I want both of you to be happy. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed not by relief alone, but by gratitude. Ryan's kindness reflected the same generosity that had always existed within his family. Daniel continued quietly. There is something else I need you to know. Ethan looked up. Daniel explained that after many sleepless nights, he had respectfully declined the engineering position in Colorado. The opportunity had been remarkable, but every future he imagined there felt incomplete because it required leaving behind the people who mattered most. He realized success no longer meant accepting every promotion. It meant choosing the life that felt genuinely meaningful. Ethan listened silently, knowing Daniel had made the decision carefully and for reasons that reached far beyond romance alone. Daniel smiled warmly. I stayed because this has been my home for many years, and because I finally understood that some opportunities cannot be measured by a job title. Ethan answered with complete sincerity. I never wanted you to give up your dreams. Daniel shook his head gently. I did not give them up. I finally recognized which dream mattered most. They remained beside the quiet lake watching sunlight dance across the water as the truth settled peacefully between them. There was no dramatic celebration, no rushed promises, and no need to force the future into certainty. Instead, they chose something stronger. They agreed to move forward slowly, openly, and with the same patience that had guided every driving lesson from the beginning. As they walked back toward the car together, Ethan realized that the safest road had never been the one without difficult turns. It had always been the one traveled with someone willing to face every mile beside him with honesty, kindness, and unwavering respect. 1 year later, the first warm weekend of autumn arrived with clear blue skies stretching above the city, and Ethan smiled as he stepped outside carrying a single set of car keys that finally belonged to him. The silver sedan that had once represented uncertainty had been replaced by a reliable car he had proudly purchased after earning his driver's license several months earlier. Even now, every time he settled behind the steering wheel, he remembered the patient voice that had first taught him to breathe before every turn and to trust himself one careful decision at a time. Daniel waited outside his house holding 2 familiar cups of coffee, smiling exactly the way he had on the morning of their very first lesson. Some traditions had quietly become too meaningful to leave behind. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat while Daniel naturally settled into the passenger seat, no longer as an instructor, but as the person who had become his closest companion. Their destination was simple. They planned to drive the same route where everything had begun 1 year earlier. The suburban streets looked almost unchanged. Maple trees once again painted the sidewalks with shades of gold and crimson. Children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods, and neighbors waved as they passed familiar front porches. Ethan guided the car confidently through every intersection, smiling whenever Daniel complimented a smooth lane change or an effortless parking maneuver, even though those skills had become second nature. Eventually, they reached the peaceful lakeside overlook where so many conversations had quietly changed the direction of both their lives. They carried their coffee toward the wooden railing overlooking calm water that reflected the brilliant afternoon sky. Neither of them hurried to speak because silence had never felt empty between them. It had always been another language they understood together. After several comfortable moments, Ethan laughed softly. "Do you remember how terrified I was during the first lesson?" Daniel smiled with gentle amusement. "You apologized every time the car slowed down too quickly." Ethan shook his head, laughing again. "I thought learning to drive would be the hardest part." Daniel looked across the lake before answering. "Life usually teaches us that the road is never the difficult part. It is finding the courage to travel it honestly." Ethan nodded quietly, realizing those words perfectly described everything they had experienced during the past year. They had chosen patience over impulse, honesty over secrecy, and respect over fear. Ryan remained one of Ethan's closest friends. Family dinners continued to feel warm and comfortable, and every important relationship in their lives had grown stronger because they had trusted truth instead of hiding from it. As the afternoon sunlight slowly settled across the lake, Ethan reached into the glove compartment and removed the folded practice notebook Daniel had given him on the first day of driving lessons. The final page contained one handwritten sentence Daniel had added after Ethan passed his driving test. "The best journeys are measured by the people beside you, not the miles ahead." Ethan smiled before carefully closing the notebook again. They returned to the car and began the drive home with the windows open, cool autumn air filling the quiet cabin while familiar roads stretched comfortably before them. Ethan realized that Daniel had taught him far more than steering, braking, or reading road signs. He had taught him that the safest direction in life is not always the easiest one. Sometimes it is simply the one chosen with honesty, patience, and love. As the evening sun disappeared beyond the trees, Ethan understood that the greatest lesson had never been about learning how to drive. It had always been about finding the courage to let his heart guide him home. And this time they traveled that road together with complete confidence in every mile waiting ahead.